Division of Emergency Management and as the FEMA administrator in the Obama administration. I've been to a lot of disasters, and I've learned a lot about how disasters impact communities as well as it impacts families and businesses. And I wanted to talk to you today about one of the risks that many of us take and don't understand as well as we should, and that's flooding. Before you stop and say, but I don't live in a flood zone, hear me out. Of all of the disasters we go to, the most frequent are floods. And in many cases, the floods don't even reach the point of receiving a presidential disaster declaration, which really looks at the impact to a state, not to a community. And too many people are misinformed or not exactly sure of what their flood risk is. And they will refer to something called the flood zone map. And they go, well, I don't live in the flood zone. Well, I want to start with the basics. First of all, those flood zone maps are not flood zone maps. They're flood insurance rate maps. Well, what does that mean? It means that it established what they call a special flood risk area. And within that special flood risk area, the highest risk flooding, there are requirements to purchase flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage. It's called mandatory flood insurance requirements. And I think this is where it got started. People heard it's not mandatory, so it's not required. And that if I don't live in the flood zone, I don't flood. Well, that's not what it meant. What it meant was if you lived in the high risk area, the special flood risk area, and you had a federally backed mortgage, in fact, most mortgage companies require you to buy flood insurance. And it also cost more because it was a higher risk. But the maps never said that outside of that special flood risk area, it didn't lower. And lower being a relative term, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It just means for the purposes of insurance, it's a lower risk outside of that special flood risk area than inside of it. And so if you've heard that you don't live in a flood zone, the better term is you don't live in a special flood risk area, and you may not have a requirement to buy flood insurance. That doesn't mean you don't have a flood risk, and it doesn't mean you're covered by your homeowner's policy. In fact, most homeowners' policies do not cover any damages caused by rising waters. Rising water? Well, that's the term they use for flooding. They just don't say water damage because it's like if a tree came through your roof and it rained in your house and it caused water damage, most homeowner policies will cover that. But if the drainage backs up, the streets get flooded, you get water into your house, your carpet gets soaked from that rising water, generally your homeowner's policy doesn't cover that. And that's why you need, even if you don't live in that special risk area, because it's one of the most common types of hazards we see. It's actually increasing in frequency, and we're seeing storms that are now wetter. As you go back to 2017, look at Hurricane Harvey, dumped close to 3.5 feet of water in Houston. Even in Florida's history, from Lake Okeechobee to a storm that hit back in the 50s in Yankeetown, set a record, hasn't been broke yet, hopefully it won't be, but over 37 inches of rain in 24 hours. Well, think about it. You know your community. What if you dump 2 to 3 feet of water in a 24-hour period? And that's again what we're seeing with a lot of these tropical systems, and in some cases non-tropical. And if that flooding occurs and you get water rising up in your home, your homeowner's policy is not going to cover it. Well, but won't FEMA come and take care of that? Not necessarily. A lot of these floods never reach the threshold our state gets declared by the president. Not even there. And in the cases where FEMA is available, most of the assistance to homeowners are going to be in the form of low-interest loans from the Small Business Administration. And before you tell me you don't have a business, why is it SBA? It's a program that Congress established in disasters to help both businesses and homeowners make repairs from disasters. And everybody says, well, what about the FEMA checks? What about, I always hear about FEMA's going to give money out to people. Well, FEMA does have a grant program for people who didn't have insurance, who could not qualify for the Small Business Administration disaster loans. But it's a rather limited amount of money. Most families probably see between $7,000, about that range damage. It goes up a little bit. The maximum amount that you can get out of that grant program is a little over $34,000, $35,000. But the key point is very few people get that, and it is a requirement that the area has to be declared by the president of disaster area. The damages have to be created or caused by that event. And the test of getting those grants comes back to insurance takes care of it. If you didn't have insurance, do you qualify for a loan? And again, nobody wants to take on more debt, but if you qualify for the loan, that's what you're going to get. It's only if you don't get that you get the FEMA assistance. And again, very limited and not very helpful when it comes to rebuilding your home. And as the administrator of FEMA, we got quite good at estimating how much damage was going to occur. And FEMA has looked at a lot of claims, and so on average, just 1 inch of water will cost about $25,000. I didn't get that wrong. $25,000. In fact, I think that number is actually low given the size of some of the homes and the cost of construction as we see it today. But think about that. Your homeowner's policy won't cover it. Doesn't matter that you didn't live in a flood zone, you flooded, and you don't have flood insurance. And you may not even be in a flood that gets declared by the president, and even if it did, the assistance may come in the form of a loan, taking on more debt. And this is, unfortunately, very common. I've been to a lot of disasters, and I'd go out and we'd speak before disasters, particularly here in Florida. One thing I hear all the time is, I've lived here all my life. It's never that bad. You guys always make it sound horrible. You're just trying to sell insurance. And then we would go back into these communities after disasters, and people say, I never knew it could be so bad. Why didn't you tell me? Oh, we tried. So here's my attempt to try to tell you something. It says you don't live in a flood zone if you're in Florida. And don't believe them if they tell you you don't have to buy flood insurance. What they probably referring to, and they're getting a mistake here, but this is what they're probably trying to tell you is, you're not in the special flood risk purchase. Doesn't mean you don't flood. And in general, it means that if you do buy flood insurance, it doesn't cost as much in a high risk area. And again, somebody says, I've lived here all my life and it hasn't flooded. Trust me. One of the things we're seeing right now is record-setting rainfall events. Well, record-setting means we don't have any record of it ever occurring, and we got pretty good weather records going back to the 1850s to the 1870s, about the time that the Weather Bureau was actually established, and the Army Signal Corps is a precursor to the National Weather Service. So as we look backward, we keep seeing these record-setting events, so our past history doesn't really prepare us for what's happening. And of all the things we're seeing increasing rapidly, it's extreme rainfall events, both from, and again, it doesn't have a lot to do with the strength of the hurricane. It has more to do with how fast the storm is moving over an area. Slower storms, a lot more rain. And again, just look around your community. What do you think 2 or 3 feet of water is going to do in those neighborhoods? We know what it's like when you get a couple inches in a heavy thunderstorm, but 2 to 3 feet, and unfortunately that's today than it was a decade ago. And your homeowner's policy doesn't cover rising water. So this is why I think it's important that we deal with getting ready for hurricane. You need to consider flood insurance. I don't live in a flood zone. I just looked at it from the standpoint of, I just don't have that kind of money available, and I don't want to take out more debt. So it made more sense to me to buy the flood insurance. Hope I never use it. Even though I'm not in the flood zone, I'm not in a high flood risk area, it's not a mandatory purchase requirement. But I didn't want to have to take out a loan, and I didn't want to have so much damage to my home I couldn't rebuild. And that's happened to a lot of people. I went to a disaster in 2016 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Again, it wasn't a hurricane, but they got a lot of rain up there in a very short period of time. And there was so much rain and so much flooding that some of the communities, they call them parishes, about equivalent to our counties, one of the parishes had 70% of the structures. That's businesses and homes that were flooded. And I think a lot of people thought when the president declared a disaster, we showed up from FEMA, that we're going to make everybody whole. And quite honestly, they were very angry when they found out that on average they were going to get $5,000 to $7,000. That FEMA would help them with some rental assistance or maybe put up in a hotel and motel while they tried to figure out what was next. And they went back to their homes, and some of them had water all the way up to their ceilings. And they're having to pull out the carpets, all the cabinets, all the sheetrock, take it down to the studs. They were dealing with mold. All of their clothing, all of their furniture was destroyed. Pictures and family heirlooms were damaged. They didn't have insurance. And for a lot of these, they had actually moved to this region after being hit by Hurricane Katrina and said, we're never going through that again. And yet they found themselves going through very similar types of impacts. Fortunately, without the loss. But there's no reason that can't happen in our communities. And again, I've seen this. I've seen it out in Colorado. I've seen it up in Maine, upper state New York. You name it, I've been there. And it hasn't been these big rivers everybody talks about, like on the Mississippi. They've been heavy rainfall, maybe a training effect of thunderstorms, maybe a low pressure system, sometimes a tropical system. And the first couple of days is a blur, but when it really starts to hit people is when they're in their, we call it homes clean out, stacking it all up on the road to be picked up. And they probably have called their insurance agent and gotten the news they weren't expecting. They didn't have any flood insurance, so they weren't covered. And now they're turning to FEMA and others and trying to figure out what's next. I don't want you to go through that. We know that if you have insurance, that's your best path forward to rebuilding. It's your best chance to make sure you can protect your property. Again, taking out more loan, taking out more debt, not being able to repair it, and you still got a mortgage are not good prospects. The other thing you need to think about is you just can't wait till there's a storm coming and say, okay, I'm going to buy it now, because flood insurance requires you to have it for 30 days before it goes into effect. So you can't wait for the next storm, and you can't buy it just because you think there's going to be a flood. You have to have it and have it year round. And again, in Florida, we think about the tropical season, but quite honestly, I've been in the state where we've had more flooding in the winter months from the stationary cold fronts that would come through than we did sometimes from the tropical activity. So it's a year-round threat. It's the one that isn't insured, and it's going to cost many people their livelihoods and their homes. For those of you that have businesses, this is really key. The federal government does not provide direct assistance to businesses in disasters. They do provide, through the Small Business Administration, disaster loans, but they don't provide any grants or assistance for businesses outside of that. So if you're a business owner, it's really key that if you plan to be in business after a disaster, you want to make sure you have insurance for this risk, and you need that flood insurance to that. Again, most of your insurance policies typically written that they exclude damage to rising waters or flooding, and it's important that you get that. Again, the important thing here is talk to your insurance agent. Look at your, guess what? You need flood insurance too. And make sure the person you're renting from gets flood insurance for the structure, because I've seen this happen. You're renting, that home gets flooded, whoever owns that home didn't have flood insurance, they can't repair it, and you just lost where you're going to live. And now you're competing with everybody else for whatever rental property's left, because it will not get rebuilt. It will probably get torn down. And then what gets rebuilt, you may not be able to afford. And then you got all that delay in between. But for your stuff, your contents, again, flood insurance is something that can protect you against those losses. So, hurricane season. Everyone's going to tell you everything else. They're going to tell you about evacuation. I just want to focus on flood insurance. You don't live in a flood zone. Wrong. You're in Florida, it floods. And think about it. You got 2 to 3 feet of rain. What doesn't flood? Standard homeowners policies do not cover damages due to rising water or flooding. And FEMA calculates that it's about $1 For every inch of damage, it's about 200 or FEMA's policies take 30 days to go into effect. So you want to make sure you talk to the agent now and look at all of your insurance coverage. And again, it's getting crazy expensive. Fortunately, flood insurance outside of that special flood risk area isn't as expensive, and it allows you to protect both the contents of your home as well as the home itself. Businesses, you can do both contents and the structure. Again, it's an additional cost, but you got to weigh that against what the risks are if you don't have flood insurance. And then finally, I want to end with this. Of all of the things that are deadly in a hurricane, the deadliest risk is flooding. Not just in the coastal communities, not just on the coast, but well inland. Again, it's primarily caused because of the extreme rainfall events we're seeing and people getting out and driving in these flood canals. They're in areas that are subject to tremendous amounts of flooding. So if you're in the areas where they tell you to evacuate, especially for storm surge, always go to higher ground. Make sure you have flood insurance. Take your pets with you. As we get ready for this hurricane season, you're going to get a lot of great advice and stuff you need to do. I just want you to focus on one of the things you need to look at to protect yourself and protect your finances, and get flood insurance. Thank you.